In American politics, the phrase "no child left behind" is one we associate first with George Bush's failures and second with America's education failures. It's a policy that has not worked, period. The funny thing is, though we condemn the policy when we hear the phrase "no child left behind," we don't necessarily condemn the actions that the policy undertakes. We associate "no child left behind" with George Bush, but the reality is that the Obama administration has continued essentially the same policy actions under a different guise. No Child Left Behind primarily does three things, each in the name of closing the national achievement gap between white students and students of color. One, it increases states' use of standardized testing to hold schools accountable for student achievement. Two, it closes schools or cuts off their funding if they don't meet performance standards. And three, it fires teachers whose students aren't measuring up. When you look at these three initiatives at first glance, they seem to make sense. We nod our heads and think, yeah, if we do those things, American education should improve and the achievement gap should close. But the reality is that statistically, No Child Left Behind is actually leaving a lot of kids behind. So why does a policy that seems to make sense just not work? Well, first and foremost, the mechanisms of American education are far more complex than simply producing good test scores. Test scores are a product, and education is a process that is often very different for students of color than typical white students. For a student of color, the process of getting a quality education is roadblocked by a deeply rooted American history of segregation and racism. It isn't a stretch for me to jump from education to racial segregation. How are public school districts funded? By the property taxes of the surrounding residents. What kind of residents pay property taxes? Residents who own homes. Who owns homes? People of color are 70% less likely to be approved for home loans than white people. So how did I jump from education to racial segregation? If you look at any major U.S. city, you will see pocketed racial communities in which those of color rent homes or own shoddy real estate, in which those of white people own homes and often valuable real estate. And then think about this. Owning a home is how wealth is accumulated, because you own equity that you can use to grow and invest your savings, and the taxes paid by homeowners are how school districts are funded. So who do you think is getting a better education? A white student living in a well-to-do suburban neighborhood, or a student of color who's living in an urban neighborhood in which everyone rents an apartment? The suburban school is inevitably going to be better resourced. If a school has better resources, then it follows that its students have an easier opportunity to get a better education. So how is it fair for school districts in bad neighborhoods to be held accountable for performing just as well on a standardized test as school districts in suburban neighborhoods? The answer is simply that it's not. The question is, how do you fix a problem so deeply rooted in American society? If you flip through education headlines in the news, catchphrases like charter schools, teacher unions, and references to popular documentaries like Waiting for Superman tend to pop up. A lot of political rhetoric on education is devoted to tearing down bad teachers and hell-bent teacher unions and praising the merits of charter schools. In popular American culture, we celebrate miracle teachers who work wonders on an urban classroom, like Hilary Swank and Freedom Writers. And then we wonder, why can't all teachers be like that? In reality, 1 in 5 charter schools are actually successful, a pitiful amount that takes the lion's share of public support. And the pedagogical model of successful charter schools is not one replicable on a grand scale. The kinds of teachers who work in charter schools tend to be low-paid, young and starry-eyed, willing to work 50 to 60 hours a week and on Saturdays, coming to work at 6 a.m. and leaving at 6 p.m. Their energy is inexhaustible and of course admirable, but how can you expect all teachers across the country to replicate these behaviors? It's no wonder teacher unions are given such a bad name. They constantly have to demand reasonable working conditions that sometimes are at the cost of urban students. Teachers are underpaid, undertrained, undercredited, and then forced to meet the huge responsibility of closing the achievement gap by themselves. Teachers in urban areas don't have the privilege of simply coming to work to educate. They must come to work and battle the obstacles of racism, poverty, immigration, and all of the obstacles that branch out from these issues, like language barriers, grade repeaters, abusive homes, drugs, gangs, and the list goes on. So clearly, a simple 3-step policy initiative isn't the answer to closing the achievement gap, as rhetorically sound as it may appear. It doesn't work to demand solid test scores from struggling schools, then fire their teachers, and then close them down. So what can be done? The Obama administration has a laundry list of problems to address to begin to tear down such a deeply rooted and systemic issue. Though it's not as satisfying as a three-step cure-all policy approach, we have to take small, widespread initiatives in order to get all American students achieving at the same standards. We need policy building blocks that can create a strong structural foundation in American society in order to allow students of color to achieve. The way school districts are funded should be evaluated. The value we place in teachers, both literally and financially, should be increased. Unions should be respected. Welfare programs should be increased. The cycle of poverty and of segregation must end. And until then, a quality education is likely to remain the privilege of the privileged.